Washington, D.C., June 1972. At the Madison Hotel, Soviet trade officials sit across from their American counterparts. The atmosphere is tense, secretive. These are not diplomats discussing missiles or treaties. They are here for something far more humiliating. The Soviet Union, a superpower spanning 11 time zones, commanding the world's largest continuous landmass, is secretly negotiating to buy food. Nearly 20 million metric tons of American wheat, a quarter of the entire U.S. harvest. How did a nation built on promises of agricultural abundance become so desperate it had to covertly purchase grain from its ideological enemy? The answer was not written in Moscow's 5-year plans or carved into the monuments of collective farms. It was welded into steel, buried in soil, and lost in the fundamental misunderstanding of what farming actually is. The answer was not a lack of rain or a lack of land. It was a single disastrous idea. The belief that farming could be treated as a factory. We are going to show you the 3 critical failures, the human, the ecological, and the mechanical, that made this collapse inevitable. The battle for agricultural supremacy wasn't won or lost in the fields. It was decided before the first seed hit the ground, in the relationship between man and machine. In Iowa, a farmer owned his John Deere 4020. Every morning, he walked around that tractor, checking hydraulic fluid levels, inspecting tire pressure, listening to the engine's rhythm. His livelihood depended on that machine's reliability. When harvest season arrived and a hydraulic pump seized, he could drive to his local dealer and have a replacement part airshipped overnight. His dealer had skin in the game. If his harvest failed, he lost a customer. 3,000 miles east, on a collective farm in Ukraine, a different story unfolded. The tractor belonged to nobody, which meant it belonged to everybody, which meant nobody cared. The kolkhoznik, the collective farm worker, was paid the same whether the machine ran perfectly or limped through the season on borrowed parts. This wasn't just a philosophical difference. It was an economic reality with mechanical consequences. After Khrushchev's government forced collective farms to purchase equipment from machine tractor stations, the financial shock was devastating. Collective farm debt increased from 32.4 billion rubles to 50.5 billion rubles by 1959, according to historian Stephan Merl, leaving farms that had never owned machinery owing crushing sums for inherited equipment. The maintenance crisis followed predictably. A 1954 CIA report documented that Soviet repair shops were fulfilling only 38 to 54% of planned repairs. Nikita Khrushchev announced the Virgin Lands Campaign, a grandiose scheme that would expand from 13 million hectares, the 1954 to 1956 target, to approximately 28 to 40 million hectares by 1960 across Kazakhstan and southern Siberia. This scarcity birthed a desperate survival mechanism to keep the machines running. New combines and tractors became donor machines, stripped of parts to keep older equipment running. It was officially criminal. Soviet law prohibited dismantling new machinery, but it became the only way to meet harvest quotas. While American farmers enjoyed dealer networks with credit terms and rapid parts delivery, Soviet farms faced a bureaucratic maze. The wrong part might arrive at the right place, or the right part at the wrong time. Central planners in Moscow couldn't possibly coordinate the repair needs of thousands of farms across 11 time zones. The human cost was clear. During harvest, a seized pump idled American operations briefly. Meanwhile, the Soviet collective waited in line at the regional supply depot, watching grain rot in the field while bureaucrats shuffled requisition forms. This vicious cycle bred indifference. Operators ignored maintenance, knowing parts were theoretical. American farmers took pride in winter rebuilds. Soviet workers faced learned helplessness, where efforts seemed futile against the system. The stage was set for a mechanical disaster of historic proportions. When human incentives crack, the machines themselves become the next casualty. The maintenance crisis that began with broken incentives soon metastasized into something far more destructive, a logistics system that literally consumed itself to survive. By the early 1960s, Soviet farms had developed an unspoken protocol. When a critical component failed, a transmission gear, a hydraulic valve, a bearing assembly, mechanics would strip identical parts from newer machines. This wasn't improvisation, it was systematic cannibalization, born from a planning system that could manufacture tractors but couldn't supply the bolts to keep them running. Economist D. Gale Johnson documented this paradox in his analysis of Soviet agriculture. It was officially a crime to cannibalize a new combine to repair several existing combines. Yet the practice was widespread, even encouraged by desperate farm managers. Warehouses filled with brand-new K700 tractors sat idle, missing single components that cost rubles, while the tractors themselves represented thousands of hours of factory labor. The Central Planning Agency, Gosplan, operated on the assumption that agricultural machinery was like any other industrial product, manufactured once, distributed efficiently, and maintained according to schedule. But farming machinery faces unique stresses. A combine harvester might operate flawlessly for 11 months, then face 3 weeks of 18-hour days during harvest. A single failed bearing during that critical window could idle the entire machine. American dealers understood this reality. John Deere's parts distribution network was designed around urgency. Dealers maintained a local inventory of high-failure components and could access regional warehouses within hours. The system was redundant, decentralized, and built for speed. When an Iowa farmer called at midnight with a broken header drive, parts were already moving. Soviet logistics worked differently. Parts requests traveled up through collective farm management, regional agricultural committees, and ultimately to central planners who might approve or deny the request based on quarterly allocation targets. The system was designed for efficiency on paper, but it ignored the fundamental reality of agricultural timing. This created cascading failures during harvest season. One failed transmission gear could idle a combine. That idle combine created a bottleneck for the entire harvest crew. Grain that should have been cut at optimal moisture content instead stood in fields, vulnerable to weather damage. The cannibalization response seemed logical, but proved catastrophically destructive. Stripping parts from new machines to repair old ones created an ever-expanding pool of partially functional equipment. Soviet factories produced impressive numbers of tractors and combines, but the actual working fleet shrank as newer machines became donor carcasses. This mechanical cannibalism reflected a deeper philosophical problem. American agriculture treated each machine as an integrated system, requiring specific components engineered to precise tolerances. Soviet agriculture treated machines as interchangeable collections of generic parts. The K700's transmission wasn't designed for the K700. It was designed to meet a planning target for transmission production. The quality implications were profound. American farmers demanded parts that matched original specifications because their profit margins depended on machine reliability. Soviet farms accepted whatever parts were available because meeting the hectare quota mattered more than long-term mechanical health. This tolerance for substitution created a culture of good enough that gradually degraded the entire machinery fleet. By the late 1960s, the cannibalization system had created its own bizarre economy. Experienced mechanics became expert at identifying which components could be swapped between different machine models. Unofficial networks developed to trade parts between collective farms. Some farms specialized in maintaining a boneyard of donor machines stripped for parts but never officially decommissioned. The psychological impact on operators was devastating. American farmers developed deep mechanical knowledge because understanding their equipment improved their profits. Soviet farm workers learned just enough to keep machines running until the next breakdown. This created a vicious cycle where less maintenance led to more frequent failures, overwhelming the supply system and forcing more cannibalization. The final irony was statistical. Soviet agricultural reports counted every manufactured tractor and combine as productive capacity, but a significant percentage of new machines never performed agricultural work. They were cannibalized before ever reaching a field. But even if the Soviets had solved their supply chain problems, they were facing a deeper, more fundamental crisis. The land itself was about to rebel. The human system was broken, but the next failure would be the information system, a blindness to ecology that would turn 40 million hectares of pristine grassland into a dust bowl. While Soviet agriculture was cannibalizing itself in the 1960s, American farming was completing a remarkable transformation, one born from its own ecological disaster 30 years earlier. The 1930s Dust Bowl represented American agriculture's darkest hour. Farmers across the Great Plains had applied European techniques, deep moldboard plowing that completely inverted the soil, to an ecosystem that couldn't sustain them. The technique buried all surface organic matter 6 to 8 inches deep, leaving fine topsoil exposed to relentless prairie winds. When drought struck, millions of acres simply blew away. Black blizzards darkened skies from Texas to Chicago. Families abandoned farms that had been profitable just years before. But here's where the American system revealed its fundamental strength. It could learn from failure. The response wasn't a top-down decree from Washington. Instead, it emerged from a collaborative network of land-grant universities, the newly created Soil Conservation Service, farmer cooperatives, and private equipment manufacturers. This wasn't central planning. It was distributed problem-solving. And if you'd like us to do a full deep dive into the 1930s Dust Bowl, let us know in the comments. And subscribe so you won't miss our upcoming stories from the fields that fed the world. But knowledge without tools remains theoretical. And so, agronomists at Kansas State University began experimenting with conservation tillage techniques. Instead of inverting soil, they tested methods that would cut through it, leaving crop residue on the surface to protect against wind erosion. The Soil Conservation Service established demonstration plots across the plains, showing farmers how contour plowing and strip cropping could prevent soil loss. American manufacturers responded to this new understanding with remarkable speed. International Harvester developed the chisel plow, an implement with curved shanks that could slice through soil without inversion. John Deere introduced the rod weeder, designed to kill weeds while leaving protective residue undisturbed. These weren't just new products. They represented a fundamental shift in agricultural philosophy, from conquering the land to working with it. The machines embodied scientific principles developed in university research plots and proven on demonstration farms. The feedback loop worked with stunning efficiency. Farmers tested new techniques, reported results to county extension agents, who communicated findings to researchers who refined methods. This system created what economists call adaptive capacity, the ability to respond to new information quickly and effectively. When university trials showed that hybrid corn varieties could double yields per acre, seed companies scaled production rapidly. When research demonstrated that anhydrous ammonia could dramatically increase nitrogen availability, chemical companies built distribution networks. The biological integration was particularly sophisticated. American plant breeders, working with both public universities and private companies, developed hybrid corn varieties specifically adapted to local conditions. By 1960, over 95% of American corn acreage was planted to hybrids, compared to virtually 0% in the Soviet Union, where Lysenko's doctrine had banned genetic research for decades. Equipment manufacturers responded to biological advances with mechanical precision. Planter manufacturers developed seed plates calibrated for hybrid corn kernel sizes. Fertilizer applicators were designed to place anhydrous ammonia at precise depths and spacing to maximize nitrogen uptake. Cultivators were engineered to work between corn rows without damaging plants bred for specific growth patterns. This created a virtuous cycle of improvement, as better seeds, planting equipment, and fertilizer applications reinforced each other to drive continuous gains in yield per acre. The information flow was remarkably fast. University extension bulletins reached farmers within weeks of research breakthroughs. Dealer clinics brought farmers together to share practical experiences with new techniques. Farm magazines published detailed comparisons of equipment performance under field conditions. By contrast, Soviet agricultural information moved through bureaucratic channels that could take months or years to reach actual farmers. Research conducted at agricultural institutes might never reach collective farms if it contradicted current planning directives. The economic incentives aligned perfectly with conservation goals. American farmers invested in soil-building practices because healthier soil produced higher yields, which generated more profit. They adopted conservation tillage because it reduced fuel costs while preventing erosion. They calibrated fertilizer applications because precision increased returns on expensive inputs. This alignment between economic incentive and ecological stewardship created a self-reinforcing system. Farmers who took better care of their land made more money, which enabled them to invest in better equipment, which allowed them to take even better care of their land. By 1970, American agriculture had transformed itself from the Dust Bowl's devastation into the world's most productive farming system. Average corn yields had tripled since 1930. Soil erosion had dropped dramatically despite increased acreage. The feedback loop between research, equipment, and practice had created an agricultural powerhouse. But while American agriculture learned from failure and embedded that learning into machines and methods, the Soviet Union repeated the same ecological mistake on an even larger canvas, turning lessons the U.S. had internalized into warnings it ignored. In 1954, Nikita Khrushchev announced the Virgin Lands Campaign, a grandiose scheme that would expand from 13 million hectares to approximately 28 to 40 million hectares by 1960 across Kazakhstan and southern Siberia. This represented an area larger than the entire state of California, to be transformed from grassland to grain production in just 5 years. The campaign embodied everything wrong with Soviet agricultural thinking. Central planners in Moscow, who had never set foot on the Kazakh steppe, decreed that the same deep moldboard plowing techniques used in the humid black soil regions of European Russia would work perfectly in the arid grasslands 2,000 miles away. They were catastrophically wrong. The Kazakh steppe had evolved over millennia as a fragile ecosystem. Native grasses sent roots deep into the soil, creating a protective web that held moisture and prevented erosion. The surface was covered with a thin layer of organic matter that acted like a sponge, capturing the region's meager rainfall and protecting the soil from Kazakhstan's fierce winds. Soviet planners ignored these ecological realities entirely. They ordered the use of massive moldboard plows that inverted the soil completely, burying all protective organic matter 6 to 8 inches deep. The native grass root systems were destroyed, leaving fine topsoil exposed to winds that regularly exceeded 50 miles per hour. The initial results seemed to vindicate the planners' confidence. Virgin lands harvests in 1956 and 1957 were spectacular, contributing over 40% of total Soviet grain production. Khrushchev declared victory, claiming the campaign had solved the USSR's food problems permanently. But the ecological time bomb was already ticking. The deep plowing had destroyed the soil's natural structure. Within 3 years, yields began collapsing. The 1960 harvest was barely half of 1956 levels. By 1963, many virgin lands areas produced less grain per hectare than the original steppe had produced in native grass for livestock grazing. The ecological damage accelerated with each passing year. Spring windstorms, which had barely disturbed the original grassland, now created dust storms that stripped away inches of topsoil annually. Satellite imagery from the period shows massive dust plumes extending hundreds of miles from former Virgin Lands areas. Unlike the American response to the Dust Bowl, the Soviet system had no mechanism for learning from this disaster. The same planners who had ordered the original plowing continued to demand deeper plowing to restore fertility. When that failed, they ordered even more intensive cultivation, creating a vicious cycle of soil destruction. Soviet agricultural scientists understood these problems and published research documenting the ecological damage. But the planning system had no mechanism for incorporating negative feedback. Admitting that the Virgin Lands campaign was failing would require acknowledging that central planning itself was flawed. Instead, planners doubled down on failed techniques. When Virgin Lands yields declined, they ordered more land to be plowed. When irrigation caused salinization, they ordered more irrigation to flush the salt. Each solution created new problems that required more extreme interventions. By 1970, the ecological foundation of Soviet agriculture was crumbling. The Virgin Lands had become a dust bowl. The Aral Sea was disappearing. Millions of hectares were contaminated with salt or stripped of topsoil. This ecological blindness was about to be stamped into the production line, creating machines that would accelerate the destruction. The ecological disasters unfolding across the Soviet Union weren't accidents of nature. They were the inevitable result of a philosophy that had been literally welded into steel. The machines each superpower built revealed everything about how they understood farming itself. In 1964, John Deere introduced the 4020, a tractor that embodied the American approach to agriculture. This wasn't just a machine, it was a hydraulic ecosystem designed to work with biology, not against it. The 4020's hydraulic system operated at 2,500 pounds per square inch, providing precise control for a suite of implements. The three-point hitch could raise, lower, and adjust implements with fingertip precision, allowing farmers to plant seeds at exact depths, apply fertilizer in precise bands, and cultivate between crop rows without damage. The power takeoff system offered multiple speed options, 540 and 1,000 RPM, to match implement requirements perfectly. This precision mattered because American farmers were chasing yield per acre, not acres per day. Every control was designed around the principle that the operator's decisions directly affected profitability. The hydraulic remote valves allowed farmers to operate multiple implements simultaneously, planting corn while applying starter fertilizer and herbicide in a single pass. This wasn't just efficiency, it was biological timing. Corn hybrids developed by Pioneer and DeKalb required precise planting dates, specific fertilizer placement, and exact seeding rates to achieve their genetic potential. On the other side of the world, Soviet factories were building a very different machine based on a very different philosophy. The Kirovets K700, introduced in 1962, was a 13-ton articulated behemoth designed for one purpose: raw drawbar power. The K700 produced 220 horsepower and could pull implements that no Western tractor could match. Its articulated design allowed tight turns despite its massive size. Soviet engineers were proud of its brute strength. It could pull a 16-bottom plow at speeds that would leave American tractors struggling. But this raw power came with devastating consequences that Soviet planners either ignored or didn't understand. The K700's weight created ground pressure exceeding 18 pounds per square inch, nearly double that of comparable American tractors. This pressure compacted soil to depths of 18 inches or more, crushing the pore spaces that roots and water needed to penetrate. Soil compaction wasn't just a theoretical problem. It reduced crop yields by 10 to 15% in the first year and continued degrading productivity for decades. The massive tires, designed for traction, rather than soil protection, created ruts that channeled rainfall into erosion gullies instead of allowing it to soak into the soil. The K700's cab was Spartan, a basic seat, minimal gauges, and controls designed for endurance rather than precision. Operators were expected to cover maximum hectares per shift, regardless of soil conditions or biological timing. The machine had no hydraulic remote outlets for precision implements because Soviet agriculture didn't use precision implements. This philosophical difference extended to the biological foundation of each system. While American farmers were planting hybrid corn varieties that could produce 120 bushels per acre with proper management, Soviet farms were still using open-pollinated varieties that rarely exceeded 40 bushels per acre. The yield gap wasn't just genetic, it was systematic. American farmers applied anhydrous ammonia through precisely calibrated applicators that placed nitrogen exactly where corn roots could access it. Soviet farms broadcast generic fertilizers when they were available, often at the wrong time and in the wrong amounts. The precision planting systems used with the 40-20 could place seeds at exact 2-inch spacing, ensuring optimal plant population and uniform emergence. Soviet planters, pulled by K700s at high speed, scattered seeds irregularly, creating uneven stands that competed for nutrients and light. Even more fundamentally, the American system integrated multiple technologies into biological partnerships. Hybrid seeds were developed specifically for mechanical harvesting. Herbicides were formulated to work with specific crop genetics. Fertilizers were timed to match plant nutrient uptake patterns. The Soviet system treated each input as separate and interchangeable. Seeds were seeds, fertilizer was fertilizer, and machines were machines. There was no integration because there was no incentive for integration. The kolkhoznik operating the K700 was paid to cover hectares, not to maximize biological potential. This mechanical philosophy reflected the broader failure of Soviet agricultural thinking, the belief that farming was industrial production that could be optimized through brute force and central planning, rather than a biological system requiring constant adaptation and feedback. The K700 built the foundation for collapse, but the final, most wasteful failure happened at the moment of truth, the harvest. The Soviet system was designed to produce grain, but it was structurally incapable of saving it. We will show you the math on the SK5 combine that proves the entire system was. The philosophical differences, cast into the very gears of the harvest, reached their ultimate expression during harvest season, when the Soviet Union's most celebrated combine harvester, the SK5 Niva, took to the fields with a mission that guaranteed disaster. The SK5 was an impressive machine by any measure. Introduced in 1973, it could cut a 15-foot swath through grain fields, powered by a 130-horsepower engine that drove both the cutting header and threshing mechanism. Soviet engineers had designed it to harvest 25 to 30 hectares per day, numbers that looked spectacular in Gosplan reports. But the SK5 was operated under a fundamentally different mandate than its American counterparts. While a John Deere 95 combine was operated to save grain, the SK5 was operated to clear hectares. The distinction would prove catastrophic. Soviet combine operators were paid based on area harvested, not grain collected. CIA analysis confirmed size and quality of the harvest and the level of production costs have little impact on financial rewards for farm workers, creating systematic incentives to meet area and speed targets rather than quality targets. Their performance reviews depended on meeting daily hectare quotas, regardless of how much grain was left scattered on the ground behind them. This created a perverse incentive system where speed was rewarded and efficiency was irrelevant. The mechanical consequences were immediate and devastating. SK5 operators ran their machines at maximum ground speed, often 8 to 10 kilometers per hour, to meet their daily targets. At these speeds, the combine's threshing mechanism couldn't properly separate grain from chaff. The cleaning system, designed up for optimal performance at 5 to 6 kilometers per hour, was overwhelmed by the volume of material flowing through it. Even Stalin, in a 1935 speech to combine operators, acknowledged the tremendous loss of 20 to 25% during harvest operations. But rather than addressing the underlying incentive problems, he praised combines for their speed, declaring that rapid harvesting was more important than careful grain collection. This philosophy persisted for decades. By the 1960s, field losses of 20 to 30% were routine during Soviet harvests. According to Stephan Merl's analysis of collective farm records, taking grain for delivery to the state had unconditional priority over minimizing waste. The system was designed to meet tonnage quotas for state delivery, not to maximize actual grain recovery. The mathematics of this waste were staggering. If a field contained 4 tons of grain per hectare, losing 25% meant leaving 1 ton scattered on the ground. Multiply that across millions of hectares, and the Soviet Union was abandoning enough grain annually to feed entire regions. But the losses didn't end in the field. The grain that SK5 combines did collect was often harvested wet and dirty because operators couldn't slow down to adjust settings for optimal threshing. Moisture content that should have been 14% for safe storage often reached 18 to 20%, creating perfect conditions for spoilage. Soviet logistics compounded these field losses into a cascade of waste. Harvested grain sat in open trucks for hours or days, waiting in queues at overwhelmed railheads. Storage facilities designed for dry grain couldn't handle the wet, debris-filled grain that poured from the fields. Mold and rot began within days. The contrast with American harvest operations was stark. U.S. combines were equipped with moisture meters that allowed operators to adjust ground speed and threshing settings continuously. When grain moisture was too high, American farmers could slow down, adjust cylinder clearances, and increase fan speed to maintain grain quality. Their profit depended on delivering clean, dry grain to elevators that paid premiums for quality. American grain elevators had invested heavily in drying and cleaning equipment, specifically because farmers demanded top prices for their crops. Grain arriving at 18% moisture was immediately dried to safe storage levels. Cleaning systems removed foreign material that could cause spoilage. The entire system was designed around the principle that saved grain was profitable grain. Soviet grain handling facilities operated under different priorities entirely. According to Merl's research, grain elevator managers were evaluated on tonnage received, not quality maintained. Wet grain was mixed with dry grain to meet average moisture targets on paper, but this practice actually accelerated spoilage throughout entire storage bins. The human element made everything worse. American combine operators developed expertise in reading crop conditions because their income depended on harvest efficiency. They learned to adjust machine settings for different grain varieties, moisture levels, and field conditions. This knowledge was valuable and rewarded. Soviet operators had no incentive to develop such expertise. They were rotated between different machines and different farms based on bureaucratic needs rather than mechanical knowledge. The SK5's complex adjustments remained at factory defaults because operators were never trained to optimize them and had no reason to care. The final irony was meteorological. When weather threatened during harvest season, American farmers worked around the clock to save their crops because every bushel represented direct income. Soviet operators maintained their regular shifts because overtime pay was limited and hectare quotas remained the same, regardless of weather conditions. A rainstorm approaching during harvest created entirely different responses. American farmers pushed their combines to the limit, accepting higher fuel costs and mechanical stress to save grain before it was damaged by moisture. Soviet operators continued their scheduled pace, leaving grain standing in fields because exceeding daily hectare targets brought no additional reward. The cumulative effect of these incentive failures was a harvest system that destroyed as much grain as it collected. The machinery was capable, but the human system guaranteed waste on an industrial scale. By 1972, the accumulated failures of Soviet agriculture had reached a breaking point. The virgin lands were blowing away. The Aral Sea was shrinking. Cannibalized machinery littered collective farms. Harvest losses exceeded 25% annually. The world's largest country, blessed with more arable land than any other nation, faced a crisis that would humble its leaders and reshape global agriculture forever. The Soviet grain harvest of 1972 collapsed to just 168 million tons, nearly 50 million tons below target. Drought had struck the virgin lands, but weather alone couldn't explain the magnitude of the disaster. Decades of soil destruction, mechanical neglect, and perverse incentives had created a system so fragile that a single bad season threatened mass starvation. Soviet leaders faced an impossible choice: admit agricultural failure publicly or find grain elsewhere. They chose secrecy, dispatching trade officials to negotiate what would become known as the Great Grain Robbery. The scale of the purchases was unprecedented. The Soviet Union secretly bought 19 million metric tons of American wheat, nearly 25% of the entire U.S. harvest. Additional purchases from Canada, Australia, and Argentina brought total imports to over 30 million tons, representing more grain than most countries produced in a decade. The irony was profound. The United States, with less than half of Soviet agricultural land, had produced such massive surpluses that it could feed both its own population and its rival superpower. The purchases sent global grain prices soaring. Wheat futures doubled within months as international markets absorbed the shock of Soviet demand. American taxpayers unknowingly subsidized the deal through export credits and price supports, effectively paying to feed the population of their Cold War adversary. The human impact was immediate and lasting. Soviet citizens faced bread shortages and rationing, while their government secretly imported American grain to prevent famine. Store shelves emptied as bureaucrats struggled to distribute imported grain through a logistics system designed for domestic production. Meanwhile, American grain elevators emptied their storage bins with unprecedented speed. The same cooperative networks that had been built to handle surplus now demonstrated their capacity to respond to sudden demand. Grain flowed seamlessly from farm storage to river barges, railroad cars, and ocean vessels bound for Soviet ports. The strategic implications were staggering. The Soviet Union, which had positioned agriculture as proof of socialist superiority, was forced to rely on capitalist efficiency for basic food security. The propaganda victory was devastating: American abundance feeding Soviet scarcity. But the deeper lesson was systematic. The United States had built an agricultural system capable of massive surplus production because individual incentives aligned with collective abundance. Farmers who maximized their yields contributed to national food security while pursuing their own prosperity. The Soviet system had created the opposite dynamic. Central planning that prioritized political targets over biological reality had produced chronic scarcity despite vast natural resources. The command economy that was supposed to eliminate waste had institutionalized it instead. The Great Grain Robbery marked the end of Soviet agricultural ambitions and the beginning of permanent dependence on Western food imports. A system built on the promise of abundance had become a monument to scarcity, sustained only by the surplus of its ideological rival. The Great Grain Robbery was the final, humiliating admission that the Soviet Union, a superpower spanning 11 time zones, could not feed itself. They had the land, they had the resources, and they had the raw steel. But they lacked the one thing that mattered: a system that rewarded care over compliance. The result was a bureaucracy that institutionalized waste, turning new machines into scrap and fertile soil into dust. The staggering irony is that the system built on the promise of abundance became a monument to scarcity, sustained only by the surplus of its ideological rival. The machines themselves, the precision hydraulic 4020 versus the soil-crushing K700, the grain-saving combines versus the hectare-clearing SK5, embodied these competing philosophies. One system built tools to work with nature, the other built weapons to conquer it.